Hello and welcome to another episode in the Cancelled Games series. Today we're looking at some of the unreleased games for Sony's PSP, a great little handheld released in 2004 in Japan and in 2005 worldwide. I loved the PSP when it was released, and I think it was the first time that handheld games could equal those on home consoles in terms of graphics and scope. So you know the drill, let's have a look at 15 of the PSP's many cancelled games. Duke Nukem Critical Mass was released on the DS in 2011, developed by Frontline Studios and published by Deep Silver and Apogee, but it was initially also planned for the PSP. Although the plot would be much the same, the PSP version would have been a third-person shooter, differing from the DS version's side-scrolling platform action. The story saw Duke sent into the future to investigate the disappearance of several other agents who have also been sent forward in time. In this bleak future, he finds Earth in a sorry state, with mankind on the brink of extinction and the remaining humans being ruled by hostile aliens. He eventually discovers that by leaping into the future, he kicked off this very chain of events by being absent when the planet needed defending from these alien attackers. Critical Mass was actually intended to be the first in a new Duke Nukem trilogy, announced by Apogee in 2008. In the second game, Duke would travel back to the present, and in the third and final game, the situation would escalate even further. By 2009, not much was said about Critical Mass, leading many to believe that it had been abandoned, but Apogee claimed that it was still planned for both the DS and PSP. Part of this conjecture was due to Apogee's parent company 3D Realms shutting down, but Apogee were adamant that this wouldn't affect them or the game, so the trilogy was still on track. Of course, during all this, 3D Realms had been developing the ill-fated Duke Nukem Forever. In May of 2009, Take-Two Interactive sued 3D Realms as they had failed to deliver the game as promised, with the development passing to Gearbox. When this happened, Take-Two sold the rights to Gearbox too, so it was assumed that Critical Mass would no longer be possible. Well, at least not with the Duke Nukem license. The decision was made to press on with the development and release it on PSN, but drop the Duke Nukem association, and Frontline Studios renamed it Extraction Point Alien Shootout, a bit of a naff title. Bizarrely, in 2011 Apogee made the surprise announcement that they hadn't lost the license at all, and Critical Mass was still a go in its original form, but only the DS version would be released. Seemingly they did complete the PSP version and even went as far as submitting it to Sony for approval, but have not officially confirmed why the PSP version was never released. Maybe it was something to do with the fiasco over the rights, or maybe it wasn't approved by Sony. I guess we may never know. The DS version got slammed as being one of the worst games to ever appear on a handheld. The PSP version looks infinitely better, with the ability to flip between first and third person viewpoints. It would have contained 9 areas containing a total of 27 missions and featured 15 weapons, plus, in true Duke Nukem style, a jetpack. The original Duke Nukem voice artist John St. John was also on board to record Duke's dialogue. Now the story doesn't end there, and this is perhaps one of the most interesting things about all this. In 2014, an early alpha build of Critical Mass was discovered at the US Library of Congress of all places, because a DVD containing the source code had been submitted there, which is standard practice for copyrighting a game. It's said that the disc was discovered completely by chance when someone was cataloguing some inventory. Galaxy's End was a planned futuristic real-time strategy game being developed by Tiki Games solely for the PSP. Details are thin on the ground for this one, but it's reminiscent of a sci-fi Command & Conquer, and judging by the name, we can reasonably assume that it was set on distant planets. Tiki Games had received preliminary approval from Sony, but couldn't find a publisher willing to take it on. With the advent of PSN, they were hopeful that they could release Galaxy's End on PSP as a digital-only release, but financial obstacles got in the way of that too, so the game was never released at all. Saints Row Undercover would have been the first time that Volition's Saints Row series had appeared on a handheld. Development began with Mass Media Games at the wheel before Savage Entertainment took over. They'd had prior experience in this area, having ported games to the PSP before, including Star Wars Battlefront 2. At first they planned to release a straight up port of Saints Row 2 for the PSP, but the project soon became an original sequel with unique characters, initially called Saints Row The Fall. The fall would have been set between the events of the first two games, but the concept then changed yet again to a story set after Saints Row 2, and that's when the title was changed to Undercover. You would take on the role of an undercover cop, hence the name, investigating inter-gang violence from within the Saints, before eventually deciding to become a member for real. The game world would have featured 20 story missions, plus all manner of other things to do, as you would expect from a Saints Row game. Looking at the footage, there are parallels with the GTA games on PSP, and although at first I thought that Saints Row wouldn't work on a handheld, to be fair, the PSP GTA games are really fun and do work on a screen that size. These clips are from a brief playable prototype that was created by Savage Entertainment, but it's pretty rough around the edges. It seems that Volition cancelled the project after they saw this prototype, as they didn't feel that it was up to scratch. This prototype lay dormant for many years until it was rediscovered on a PSP dev kit at Volition's offices, and they actually did a playthrough of it on their channel in 2016, which I'll leave a link to in the video's description. Before Tomb Raider Anniversary was released by Crystal Dynamics in 2007, a game called Tomb Raider 10th Anniversary Edition was being developed by Core Design. This would have been a recreation of the original 1996 Tomb Raider with extra features, added content and some modern polish. It was headed to the PSP as well as the PS2 and PC, although this prototype footage is from the PSP version. We can learn how the project came about from an interview with Richard Morton, one of Core's artists who had worked on the Tomb Raider series since its inception, conducted by Planet Lara, who very kindly supplied the footage for this entry. At the time they had developed a 3D engine for the game Free Running, released for several systems including the PSP. They experimented with it by putting a Lara Croft model into the engine, and this gave birth to the idea of Tomb Raider 10th Anniversary. Eidos loved the idea, and Core worked on the project for 9 months before it was ultimately cancelled. It's speculated that when Core were bought by Rebellion in 2006, Eidos weren't keen on letting them develop a Tomb Raider game, and seeing as Crystal Dynamics had also begun development of their own Tomb Raider Anniversary game, this project was cancelled in favour of that one. Core Design officially announced its cancellation on the 15th of July 2006, the same week the trailer had appeared, and the very next day, Eidos announced the Crystal Dynamics Anniversary game. Resident Evil Portable was to be a brand new Resi game exclusively for the PSP. I won't linger on this one for too long as there's absolutely nothing to show beyond this E3 2009 announcement footage. Slated for a 2010 release, Capcom promised a whole new game designed specifically for the handheld. Strangely, after E3 absolutely no new information came to light, and at the following year's E3 Capcom showcased Revelations on 3DS, but there was absolutely no mention of the PSP game. It wasn't officially cancelled either, so God knows what happened to this one. Sticky Balls was a planned puzzle game being developed for the PSP by UK based Z2. No, not named after a condition one might suffer after sitting in a leather chair in the summertime, Sticky Balls was in fact a puzzler that blended elements of pool with Super Monkey Ball. Z2 designed the concept for pocket PCs, with the balls being controlled by the touchscreen. This concept was developed to the prototype stage, but was not necessarily made with a commercial version in mind. When their prototype gained some traction after it was distributed around the UK games industry, Z2 decided to expand on it. Z2 was bought by Warthog in 2002, and a new version of Sticky Balls was then planned for the PSP. This would have had different gameplay, although the same basic idea. Warthog was then in turn bought by Tiger, and they moved the development of Sticky Balls to the Gizmondo, for which it was actually released, although as a third and again different concept. The Elder Scrolls Travels Oblivion was a portal entry in Bethesda's Elder Scrolls series of RPGs heading to the PSP. It was being developed by Climax Group London in 2005 and 6 and would be based on the fourth entry in the main Elder Scrolls series, Oblivion. Obviously, a PSP Elder Scrolls would have had to be significantly cut down, so this would have been a much more linear affair than the open world main series games. Rather than exploring the world freely to partake in adventures, complete quests or simply explore the landscape, there would have been a central hub in which the player could pick up quests and purchase items from vendors. This hub would then allow transport to several gameplay areas via the use of a teleportation crystal. The story saw you aiding a mage in his mission to stop the Oblivion crisis, so events would take place at the same time as those of Oblivion, and their plots would often intertwine, which would have been a treat for Elder Scrolls fans. It would feature over 180 quests, including main story and side quests, so it was a pretty ambitious project. At one point they even suggested that it would span 2 UMDs. The hardware limitations weren't the only thing to consider when creating a portable Elder Scrolls game. The PSP controls had to be taken into account too, as obviously it has only one analog stick. To combat this, Climax developed a combat system that involved the targeting of an enemy's body parts, presumably similar to the VATS targeting system in Fallout. There would also be a new inventory system, and it would have the levelling and conversation interfaces typical of an Elder Scrolls game. The Elder Scrolls Travels Oblivion was scheduled for a spring 2007 release, but it was eventually cancelled with no reason given. The playable prototype was released online sometime later in 2016 and looks damn impressive. It's a work in progress, but shows that they are achieving great things considering the hardware. A portable Elder Scrolls game would have been great, but would it have been as good without the series' usual open world gameplay? Maybe not. The Retriever, also known as Jet Li's The Retriever, was a third-person action beat-em-up being developed in 2005 by Sony for the PlayStation 2 and PSP. Sony actually planned 3 Jet Li games, the first being Rise to Honor, which was released on the PS2 in 2004. After it received reviews that were average at best, Sony presumably decided to scrap the Retriever and a sequel to Rise to Honor, although I'm just assuming that was the reason. Nothing's really known about this game beyond you would be controlling Jet Li as he busts out all manner of kung fu moves. The footage available shows a dojo style training session akin to Shenmue, so perhaps you would have been able to train to learn new techniques, or it would simply serve as the game's tutorial. Interestingly, the prototype footage has Jet Li's face pixelated, although you can clearly tell that it's him. Maybe this was due to some kind of licensing issue. Traxion was a rhythm game heading to the PSP in 2006, developed by UK-based Kuju Entertainment and to be published by LucasArts. This would be a collection of mini-games which would interact with music, but the twist was that it would use tracks contained on your PSP's memory stick. So, as well as the tunes included with the game, you could import your own tunes from your music collection by copying them to the system's memory stick. Quite unusual for a rhythm game. This was achieved by what the devs called the game's unique music analysis tool, which would adapt the dozens of minigames to fit with your imported music. This was demonstrated in the trailer, which shows several tracks of varying genres changing the gameplay. They boasted a quote dazzling visual and sensory experience, and ensured that the gameplay was essentially infinitely varied due to the game playing differently with each track. And seeing as you can import your tracks ad infinitum, you had endlessly varied gameplay at your fingertips. For some reason, Traxion was cancelled in early 2007. Nap's team announced that Gekido the Dark Angel would be a PSP only entry in their Gekido series of beat-em-ups, with a planned Christmas 2006 release date. The original game Gekido Urban Fighters was released on the original PlayStation in 2000. As its name suggests, this was a 3D brawler taking place in city streets. The PSP sequel The Dark Angel looks like it has a traditional Japanese setting, and the protagonist, or at least one of them, has a huge sword on his back. This is an early prototype, so it doesn't look great visually, in fact looking worse than its last gen predecessor. Only a handful of screenshots and a trailer emerged before Nap's team went silent regarding the project, with little to no information, and it was quietly cancelled. Advent Shadow was a planned PSP spin-off of the sci-fi action-adventure third-person shooter Advent Rising, released on Xbox and Windows in 2005, developed by GlyphX Games and published by Majesco. The plan was for Advent Rising to be the first in a trilogy, with the PSP's Advent Rising being a spin-off in addition to the main games. Advent Rising itself was considerably hyped by Majesco, having an extensive advertising campaign including trailers in cinemas. It certainly promised a great deal, with Ender's Game writer Orson Scott Card involved with writing the story. The plot saw you assume the role of Marin Steele, a mercenary pilot who finds herself in the middle of an intergalactic kerfuffle involving aliens attacking with the desire to completely wipe out mankind. She eventually bumps into Gideon, the player character from Advent Rising, and together they must take on the hostile alien forces. The available footage is an early build, as is evident by the text "Work in Progress" displayed on the screen. Still, it seems to showcase the agility that Marin possesses, allowing her to jump from wall to wall run and climb with considerable skill, sort of like an ultra nimble Nathan Drake. Any enemies present are static, and it doesn't look like they can be interacted with, so they were most likely placeholders at this stage. The gameplay is taking place on a huge space station which is orbiting a planet. I'm not sure if this is Earth or another human populated planet, but either way it looks pretty striking. Majesco ran into some money troubles, and despite their big advertising push, Advent Rising didn't perform as well as expected, so Advent Shadow was cancelled in early 2006, as well as any planned sequels in the main series. Earthworm Jim, also known as Earthworm Jim PSP, was a new game in the series being developed exclusively for the PSP by Shiny Entertainment, to be published by Atari. It was announced at 2006's E3 by Atari, who held the rights to the franchise at the time. It was actually being developed by some of the Shiny Entertainment team who worked on the original two games. Because of this fact and some aspects hinted at in the trailer, it was at first believed that this would be a remake of the original. It was in fact a new game, featuring mostly new content, although some parts of the original two games would be included. As such, it was very much a 2D platform / run and gun game with 3D graphics. The gameplay seems on par with the original games, but reportedly had a few new features, including the ability to collect upgrades for Jim's suit and a 2-player mode. Earthworm Jim was apparently as much as 80% complete, although some think this is an exaggeration, but playable builds of the game did go out to the media. It was headed for an early 2007 release, but was cancelled in mid 2007, although Atari did refer to the project as being on hold. Isle of Minnow was being developed for the PSP by Sumo Digital in 2006. Sumo were no strangers to developing games for the PSP, which makes the lack of information here surprising. Very little was known until a prototype was found, which interestingly came from some pre-production UMDs that Sumo produced in May of 2006. Despite the fact these weren't intended for retail purposes, a few inevitably made their way out into the world, with some even being sold on eBay for up to $100. So the only details we have on Isle of Minnow stem from this demo, which was fully playable and even had a multiplayer mode. The demo begins with a boy washing up on the shore of an island after a shipwreck. This boy is the player character. He makes his way through a cave and finds himself in a small island town called Leafy Cove. After talking to a couple of the town's residents, you learn that the demo has several activities in which you can partake, which are essentially various minigames. These can be triggered by talking to the town's inhabitants, who give you tasks. The minigames shown in the footage include mowing a lawn, fishing and collecting feathers. The graphics are very nice but have a very cutesy style, so Isle of Minnow was more likely than not designed with young children in mind. The game was cancelled without any fanfare, so the details around its cancellation are just as mysterious as the game's story. Shaolin Streets was a beat 'em up being developed by Jailed Games for the PSP and PS2 in 2005. This footage is actually from a PS2 prototype, but generally the PS2 and PlayStation 2 versions of games were more or less similar. The playable beta was leaked online and shows some promise. It clearly has issues with clipping and camera blind spots, but the combat system looks reasonably well developed. The fighting, obviously inspired by the kung fu studied by Shaolin monks, includes combo attacks, blocks and grapples. The player character can also perform several gymnastic moves like climbing, jumping off of walls and flipping over railings and fences. Shaolin Streets was eventually abandoned on the PS2 and PSP, and development was shifted to the Xbox 360 and PS3, but these versions were also subsequently cancelled and Jailed Games went bust. Ushiro is a turn-based RPG initially intended for the PSP. It was being developed by Level 5 Games and features their signature art style. Level 5 made some great games in recent years like Ni no Kuni, and I have a particular soft spot for the Professor Layton games. First announced in 2008, Ushiro was an RPG with a horror theme. You play as a young girl who can interact with ghosts, although how this had intertwined with the gameplay isn't clear. Despite this being 2008 footage from the PSP version, it looks absolutely stunning with gorgeous anime style graphics. The cutscenes look especially good, but there's relatively little gameplay footage, although what we can see looks of a very high visual quality. Following the announcement, nothing more was heard from Level 5 Games regarding Ushiro until they removed it from their website in the latter half of 2009. It's unclear what stage in the development process was reached, but it was at least in a playable state. Nothing more was said on the matter until late 2018, a full 9 years later, when Level 5 surprisingly announced that Ushiro was being revived for the Nintendo Switch. No doubt the Switch version will look even better than this one does, so it's definitely one to keep an eye on. So that was 15 of the many unreleased PSP games. Let me know in the comments what you think of them, and as always, thanks for watching. You can find the other episodes in my Cancelled Games series in this playlist.